When you come upon a word you don't understand while reading, you have three options. You can choose to look it up in a dictionary, ignore it, or try to figure out what it means based on the context in which it's used. If you're in a test environment, you don't usually have the luxury of a dictionary, and it certainly isn't wise to ignore the word altogether. Therefore, it's a good skill to learn how a word's context can help you better understand what the word means. Searching for a word's context is as simple as looking at other words around the troublesome word. There are, in general, 5 main types of context clues: illustrations, synonyms, contrasts, inferences, and punctuation. The first context clues fall into the category of illustrations, examples or explanations of the word. This may seem overly simple, but difficult words are often followed by information the writer uses to explain the word's meaning. Look for words like such as, including, for instance, and like. This can be the author's way of further clarifying a difficult word, and you can sometimes make a logical guess about the word's meaning from the example alone. Take a look at this sentence. An occupation such as that of a hat maker or a postman is important for anyone who wants to earn a steady wage. In this sentence, we're looking at the word occupation. Not only is it a long word that we might not understand at first, but it also has multiple meanings. An occupation can mean a job, but it can also mean to take up space. It can even be used to talk about military invasion when one country is occupying another. When we look at the sentence, though, we see 2 examples given of the word in question. Neither a hat maker or a postman are particularly prone to occupying other countries, or at least that's not their primary purpose. So we can assume that the word occupation is referencing a job or employment opportunity. A second category of context clues is synonyms. A synonym is a word that shares a near meaning with another word. For example, loud and noisy mean similar things but are 2 different words. Take a look at the following sentence to see how synonyms can be good context clues. The patient's hippocampus was an uncharted minefield. His memory was so bad, the psychiatrist wondered whether that part of the brain was even processing memory and emotion the way it should. Hippocampus is a very confusing word in this sentence. Right away, the word brain tells us that the hippocampus is likely a part of the brain. In fact, it's the part of the brain thought to be responsible for memory and emotion. The sentence says the psychiatrist was concerned the patient's memory and emotion weren't being processed the way it should be. So we can deduce that the hippocampus is responsible for those processes. The clue had both synonyms, the word brain, and a full reinstatement of the initial sentence that clarified what the hippocampus was. A third helpful context clue is the contrast or antonym clue. Antonyms are the opposite of synonyms. For example, hot and cold are antonyms. Sometimes contrast sentences can tell us what a word is not, and that in turn can give us an idea of what the word is. Look at this. Mary was known for having smooth skin, but to her horror, she woke up on her wedding day with a papule on her nose. Do you know what a papule is? Neither did I, actually, but I can see the word but contrasting whatever it is with Mary's smooth skin. That, coupled with a clue about her nose, leads me to believe it is a zit of sorts, which in fact it is. A fourth clue to help you gain a bit of context surrounding words you don't understand is inference, or general context. This is a bit more vague of an explanation, but it basically means that sometimes we don't have clear synonyms or antonyms, and we don't have an illustration after the difficult word. Sometimes we just have to look at the paragraph as a whole and put a few floating parts together. This is best explained with an example. The haberdashery was Bob's favorite place. He bought all his suits there. The staff was friendly and always respectful. There's no direct description of what a haberdashery is, but the second sentence tells us that at the very least it sells suits. We also see that it's Bob's favorite place, so we can guess without certainty, but it's still a clue that it's a clothing place for men. The word staff couples with the word bought to let us know it's likely a store of some sort. The final helpful context clue is the clue of punctuation. Sometimes commas or quotation marks can be used to clarify the meaning of a word. Quotation marks can show the word has special meaning. Brackets can enclose additional explanation, and italics can further define a word. Think about the following. Matcha, Japanese green tea, has many health benefits. The parenthetical phrase gives a pretty clear description of what matcha is. In many ways, this kind of punctuation is the easiest context clue of all to deduce. These are the 5 main clues you can fall back on when trying to decipher the meaning of a difficult word. But in general, remember that when you come upon a word that isn't in your vocabulary, you don't have to give up. Paragraphs often hold together clues that can give you helpful hints about what the mystery word actually means.
Regardless of our level of schooling, whether you're a student or working in a corporate environment, we all come across words that we don't know. Thankfully, figuring out the meaning of words can be done without Google or a dictionary. Here are a few tips on how to find the meaning of an unknown word. Context is the setting or scene in which an idea or event takes place. In writing, context can help us understand the situation and how a word is being used. In other words, the sentence the unknown word is in can help you figure out its definition. Read the sentences before and after the unknown word to help you determine what the word could mean. The actual definition of a word can be changed depending on the context around it. Let's look at an example. It's a match. Here, the word match has little context to it. Are we referring to a match that makes fire, or did someone find an identical pair of shoes? We don't really know in this case what match means because there is no context. So let's add some. She pulled a 3 of clubs from the deck of cards and placed it next to the 3 of diamonds and yelled, "It's a match!" Here, because of context, we know we are not reading about a match that makes fire, but a matching pair of cards. As you can see, context can make quite the difference. Let's look at using structural analysis or looking at the different parts of the word. Many words, even some of the shortest ones you can think of, are made up of some combination of prefixes, suffixes, and roots. Prefixes are the parts of words that come at the beginning. Examples of prefixes are re, pre, de, and many more. Each of these word segments has a meaning. Here's a few examples. The prefix re means to do again, like in the word reuse. The prefix pre means before, like in the word prepare. And the prefix de means to undo, like in the word detach. Prefixes can also change the original meaning of a word. For example, do means to perform an action, but what if we add the prefix un to it? It now becomes undo, which means the opposite of do. Knowing what prefixes mean can help you determine a word's meaning. Suffixes serve the same role as prefixes, but suffixes come at the end of a word. For example, the suffix ment means a result, like in the word government. The suffix yun refers to a process, like in the word invention. The suffix full means full of, like in the word useful. Again, just like prefixes, suffixes can change the original meaning of a word. For example, to govern means to rule over something. It's an action or verb. When we add the suffix ment to the word, it now becomes government, which is a system that rules over something, a thing or noun. Though Latin is no longer used in the common world, many English words have Latin roots. Knowing and recognizing these root words in common English can help you determine a word's meaning. Here are a few examples of words with similar Latin roots. The Latin root rhino means nose. You can see this in the words rhinoplasty, rhinoceros, and rhinovirus. The Latin root reg means to control. You can see this in the words regulate, regime, and regal. The Latin root tox means poison. You can see this in the words toxic, detox, and intoxicated. This doesn't mean you need to learn a dead language to learn the definition of more English words. However, the more English vocabulary you learn, the more connections you'll be able to make to new words you didn't know before. For example, if you don't know the meaning of a word, look at the root word and see if you can think of other words that you do know that have similar roots. For example, if you don't know the definition of animate but can identify the root anim, you can think of words with the same root that you do know, like animal. From there, you can determine what the root word anim means, alive or life, along with context, if there is any, and figure out how it relates to the unfamiliar word. In this example, we know anim means life, just like animals are alive and move freely. Therefore, we can figure out that animate, the act of moving objects, is aptly named because it's bringing still or motionless objects to life. What if we took this example a step further and add a prefix to the word animate? The prefix in means not. Therefore, if we add in and animate together, we get the word inanimate, which means, you guessed it, to not move. Prefixes, suffixes, and roots make up countless words. The context of the sentence these mystery words are found in can also bring its true meaning to light. When put together, these tools can be used to solve the meaning of unknown words and make reading and writing easier.
Have you ever used a word intending one meaning and someone else took it a completely different way? Welcome to this Memetrics lesson on denotation and connotation. Denotation is the literal meaning of a word. In other words, it's the objective meaning of a word, or the meaning most widely agreed upon by scholars that is not based on personal experience. Connotation is the literal meaning of a word along with the emotions associated with it. Connotation is the subjective meaning of a word, or relative to an individual's experience. Let's take a look at shady. Shady, by its denotation, is a word used to describe the amount of sun a tree blocks out with its leaves. In this context, shady is a neutral word that doesn't really evoke any sort of emotion. In a different context, looking at connotation, Jim might call Tina shady. Here, the word possesses a negative connotation that implies slyness or sneakiness. Another word we can look at is unique. Unique means for something or someone to be original, to stand out from the norm, or one of a kind. In this case, unique would have an arguably positive connotation. Most people like to stand out, and that's not a bad thing. On the other hand, unique could be used in an insulting manner, making fun of someone and implying that they are weird or strange. Now, let's look at the words childish and childlike. Both of these words have similar denotations relating to the behaviors of a child. However, both words carry entirely different connotations. When the word childish is said and is directed to another person, oftentimes it is being used as an insult to that person to make a statement on their maturity level. To call someone or something childlike implies this sort of whimsical quality to their actions. This in turn gives the word childlike a more positive connotation than the word childish. Understanding the connotations and denotations of words can be very helpful when crafting meaningful sentences. If you write oblivious to widely accepted connotations, you will be miscommunicating ideas to your audience. They will comprehend your writing one way while you are intending it a completely different way.
Irony is a literary and rhetorical device commonly used in art, particularly in literature. In this video, we will take a look at the three main forms of irony found in literature and how they differ from sarcasm. First, let's define irony. Dictionary.com includes 6 separate definitions of irony, but today we'll just be looking at these 3. The use of words to convey a meaning that is the opposite of its literal meaning. A technique indicating an intention or attitude opposite to that which is actually or ostensibly stated, and an outcome of events contrary to what was or might have been expected. As can be seen in these 3 definitions, there is at least one crucial element that binds all examples of irony together: oppositeness or contrariness. A subversion of expectations does not necessarily make something irony. That is, an unexpected ending to a play, a plot twist that comes out of left field, are not necessarily ironic. Now let's take a look at these 3 specific forms of irony a bit more closely. Verbal irony occurs when a character or narrator says one thing but means another. One important aspect to consider here is that verbal irony, unlike dramatic or situational irony, requires the intention of the speaker. For this form of irony to be understood, then, the reader or viewer must be aware of the speaker's intended meaning. Note that this is the only form of irony in which the character or narrator consciously creates the irony on his or her own. Let's look at a couple of examples. Jonathan Swift writes the following in A Modest Proposal. "I rather recommend buying the children alive and dressing them hot from the knife, as we do roasting pigs." Swift, of course, is not literally arguing for children to be eaten. Readers know this because they are, hopefully, aware that the book is a work of satire. In this case, then, Swift is using verbal irony. His intended meaning is opposite or contrary to what is literally stated. A subclass of verbal irony comes in the form of the ironic simile. Standard similes are figures of speech comparing 2 indistinct things. For example, saying that someone's skin is as dry as bone or her hair was as dark as night are examples of similes. Ironic similes use this same form but do so in a contrary manner. Common examples include as clear as mud, as soft as concrete, as quick as molasses. Verbal irony is often confused with sarcasm. There is much varied debate on distinguishing between the 2 categories, but we'll discuss that in a moment. The next type of irony is dramatic irony. Dramatic irony happens in a narrative, whether that be a play, novel, film, or some other form, when an event occurs that is understood by the audience but is unknown to one or more of the characters. Dramatic irony, then, depends on the audience knowing more than the characters about events occurring in the work. This type of irony often functions as a form of foreshadowing. Since we know more than the characters, we can make educated guesses about the potential outcome. In other words, we can predict the inevitable conclusion with our own knowledge that would undoubtedly change the actions of characters if they had it as well. The meaning of the character's actions, then, is interpreted differently by the audience due to the audience's extra knowledge regarding events in the story. This knowledge also creates tension and suspense for the readers or watchers. For example, near the end of Shakespeare's Romeo and Juliet, Juliet drinks a sleeping potion that makes her appear to be dead. As readers or viewers of the play, we are aware that Juliet is alive. However, the characters in the play believe she is dead. This leads the lovelorn Romeo to drink actual poison in a moment of despair. Upon awakening, Juliet stabs herself upon finding her dead lover. This is an example of dramatic irony. Dramatic irony is quite common in film. For example, when we see an oblivious character in a horror film flee into a closet where we know the killer is located, then we are witnessing an example of dramatic irony. We, the audience, know, but the character doesn't. Similarly, Disney films often use dramatic irony. We know that the witch's apple is poisoned, but Snow White does not. We also know that the Beast in Beauty and the Beast is a prince, but this fact is not known by Belle until the end. Now that we've reached the final type of irony, we'll be looking at situational irony. Situational irony denotes a reversal of expectations. In other words, one outcome is expected, but something completely different results. Unlike dramatic irony, situational irony does not depend on the audience having extra knowledge that the characters do not have. In fact, we are just as oblivious as the characters in terms of what we know. Instead, our expectations are reversed, resulting in often tragic or humorous effect. The Wizard of Oz, L. Frank Baum's novel and the film of the same name, contains an example of situational irony. During the film, Dorothy and her band of companions in need of solutions to their perceived problems set out on a mission to find the Wizard of Oz. The wizard's wisdom, Dorothy believes, is the only means for her to get back to Kansas, for the cowardly lion to become courageous, and so on. However, we learn that the wizard is powerless, a man behind a curtain, pretending to be wise and all-powerful. Each character discovers that they have the solutions to their own problems and do not require the help of the wizard. That is, the cowardly lion was, in fact, brave all along. He just didn't know it. Here, our expectations and the expectations of the characters are contradicted. The wizard was not the answer to all of the problems. Again, this is situational irony, but it would be an example of dramatic irony if we knew from an earlier point in the story that the wizard was a fraud and that each character already had the solutions to his or her problems. As you look for irony in different media, it's important to note that sarcasm is not included. Sarcasm is often labeled as ironic in everyday speech. However, though related to the idea of irony, it is not technically irony. Like I said before, there is much debate surrounding the irony-sarcasm division. Let's take a closer look. Sarcasm is similar to irony in that it expresses the opposite of the speaker's intended meaning, which means it is often confused with verbal irony. Here are some characteristics that distinguish sarcasm from irony. Sarcasm is often easily distinguished from verbal irony because it is a result of the speaker's annoyance. For example, a teenager being asked to clean his room might say, "I'd love to." Of course, the teenager wouldn't love to and is therefore expressing the exact opposite of his feelings. In this case, the teenager is being direct, aggressive, and mocking. It is a product of his irritation. Compare this with the earlier examples of verbal irony. Swift's ironic argument in favor of cooking children and Antony's ironic praise of Brutus. These two examples of verbal irony are used to humorous effect, Swift, or to heighten the dramatic aspects of the situation, Shakespeare. In this way, they serve a function as literary devices. Expressing annoyance, however, does not. At the end of the day, the distinction between verbal irony and sarcasm can be subtle. Different scholars, dictionaries, and resources will have varied definitions regarding what counts as irony and what should more appropriately be called sarcasm. Distinguishing between the three main forms of irony used in literature can be a difficult task. In particular, be mindful when separating proper irony from sarcasm. Effective use of irony is a literary device that can add a lot, be tension, humor, or an element of surprise, among other things, to a literary text. Here's a quick review question to test your knowledge. Which is an example of dramatic irony? A. A man stuck in a long line exclaims, "Oh, perfect." B. A writer satirically praises the benefits of global warming. C. A character is thought to be a murderer by other characters, but audience members know this is not the case. D. Characters and readers are both surprised by an unexpected turn of events. The correct answer is C. Choice A is an example of sarcasm because of the annoyance of the speaker. Choice B is an example of verbal irony, and choice D is an example of situational irony.
I've told you to clean your room a million times. When I was your age, I had to walk 15 miles to school barefoot in the snow. Ever heard statements like that before? These are examples of an overstatement, or hyperbole, which is one of the things we'll be looking at in this video. We'll also be looking at the opposite of a hyperbole, an understatement, and how writers use these figures of speech to enhance their work. So, as you can tell from those two examples, a hyperbole is defined as obvious and intentional exaggeration. It's an extravagant statement or figure of speech that is not intended to be taken literally. We use hyperbole, or at least hear it, quite often in day-to-day conversation. For example, you might say to a friend, "I haven't seen you in an eternity." You saw this friend just last week, but to get the point across that it has felt like a long time, you exaggerate by using a word that implies it's been forever. Since this is an exaggeration and is not meant to be taken literally, it is a hyperbole. It is crucial to keep in mind that there are certain elements that make a hyperbole's function differ depending on context. In this case, the word eternity was used to create emphasis, but in a different situation, it could be used ironically. If you just recently saw your friend and coincidentally encountered him 20 minutes later, then making the same hyperbolic statement would have an ironic effect. Whether for emphasis or irony, hyperbole is never literal and is always an intentional and obvious exaggeration. Hyperbole is not just something that we use in conversation. Authors have used it as a literary tool for centuries. Take Shakespeare's A Midsummer Night's Dream, for example. The character Aegeus is in opposition to the relationship between his daughter and Demetrius, saying, "With cunning hast thou filched my daughter's heart." Obviously, Demetrius did not literally steal the blood-pumping organ from Aegeus's daughter. Saying that he has stolen her heart is an exaggerated way to imply that Aegeus is displeased with the situation. Here's a more recent example from Kurt Vonnegut's Slaughterhouse-Five. When the Americans and their guards did come out, the sky was black with smoke. The sun was an angry little pinhead. Dresden was like the moon now, nothing but minerals. Here, Vonnegut describes the aftermath of the bombing of Dresden during World War II. The hyperbolic sentence, Dresden was like the moon now, nothing but minerals, works to emphasize the destruction of the city after its bombing. This arguably has a much more powerful effect than simply saying Dresden was badly damaged. The hyperbole here may overstate the extent to which Dresden was damaged, but it drives the point home that the damage was extensive, perhaps difficult to put into language beyond the use of hyperbole for a reader who did not experience the bombing of the city as Vonnegut did in real life. So now that we've looked at hyperbole, let's flip things around and look at understatements. Instead of exaggerating, an understatement works by diminishing or minimizing the facts or situation at hand. Without context, these statements appear to be normal. Let's look at some examples. I could have done a little better on the test. Without context, you might assume that this person did reasonably well on the test, perhaps scoring an 80 out of 100. However, if this person only made a 20 out of 100, his remark would be an understatement. He obviously could have done a lot better on the test. Other examples would be saying, "It rained a bit more than usual," after a storm that lasted an entire week, or saying, "We've had better games," after losing 70-0. Understatement, then, is often humorous and usually ironic. However, it can also be used sincerely in everyday speech for speakers to minimize or downplay the situation. Take the last example. The football player could be commenting on how terribly the game went in a humorous way, or he could be minimizing the importance of the loss in an attempt to distract from the terrible score so he could move on. Understatement is also used quite often in literature. Here's an example from Shakespeare's Romeo and Juliet. "What, art thou hurt?" "Aye, a scratch, marry, 'tis enough. Where is my page? Go, villain, fetch a surgeon." In this scene, Mercutio has been mortally wounded. Understatement appears when he reduces his wound to a mere scratch. Understatement in this case can serve a few purposes. For one, it tells us something about Mercutio as a character. His willingness to call his severe wound a scratch suggests that he is courageous and stoic. Secondly, for readers or viewers of the play, this initial assessment of the wound may lead to the belief that it is not so severe. Thus, realizing later on that the wound is mortal may come as a more dramatic and powerful shock. Let's move into the 20th century with F. Scott Fitzgerald's The Great Gatsby. "I've got a nice place here," he said, his eyes flashing about restlessly. Turning me around by one arm, he moved a broad, flat hand along the front vista, including in its sweep a sunken Italian garden, a half-acre of deep, pungent roses, and a snub-nosed motorboat that bumped the tide offshore. Here, the extravagantly wealthy Tom Buchanan describes his place as merely nice. The latter description shows that the place is much more than nice, thus calling it such is an understatement. The understatement in this case could say a lot about Tom. He could be attempting to downplay the magnitude of his estate in order to avoid appearing like a braggart, or he may be so used to his wealthy lifestyle that he can only think of what most people would think of as extremely extravagant as nice. Okay, now that we've looked at overstatements and understatement, here's a review question to test your knowledge. Which is an example of hyperbole? A, the man was very tall. B, I would have liked to do a little better. C, the universe could be considered quite large. D, the spider was the size of a Buick. The correct answer is D. Though the spider may be large, saying it is the size of a car is an exaggeration. I hope this review was helpful. Thanks for watching and happy studying.